King Valkor watched the holographic battlefield flicker, before him the cold blue light reflecting off his obsidian throne. The Zalzir fleet was dying. His warlords stood in rigid silence as their finest warships, monuments of a 1,000-year empire, were torn apart like dry leaves in a storm. The enemy moved with brutal efficiency, the Vordaks swarm carving through their defenses, as if they had already foreseen every counterstrike. The Zalzir were warriors, proud conquerors of 10 systems, yet today they were prey. A deep growl rumbled from Valkor's throat, his claws tightening against the armrest of his throne. His people were not meant to beg for salvation, not from any species, and certainly not from humans. Yet the human envoy stood before him, now hands behind his back, gaze unwavering. Elias Rourke was not a warrior by Zalzir standards. No fangs, no battle scars, no noble lineage. Just a man in a dark uniform with eyes that had seen war beyond counting. "You are losing," Rourke said simply. Valkor's warriors bristled, their tails snapping against their armor in warning. The insolence of the human was intolerable, yet Valkor did not silence him. He already knew the truth. Their fleet was outmaneuvered, their soldiers overwhelmed, and the Vordaks would not stop until Zalzir Prime itself was stripped to its bones. The Dominion had never faced an enemy it could not break. Until now. "And your solution, human," Valkor's voice was steel-wrapped in contempt, "to kneel before your Terran Federation, beg for scraps like a dying animal." Rourke didn't flinch. He stepped forward. "No, king. My solution is to teach you how to win." Laughter echoed through the chamber, cold, sharp, filled with derision. Valkor's second-in-command, Lord Korik, sneered. "We have fought for centuries, human. You have been in the stars for what, a blink of an eye." Rourke tilted his head. "And yet here I stand while your fleets burn." Silence. The king's claws tapped against the throne, the sound measured, deliberate. He despised the human's arrogance, but he despised the truth more. A human strategist offering aid to the Dominion was an insult. And yet the alternative was extinction. "How?" Valkor asked, the word tasting like poison. Rourke activated his holopad, and a new battlefield unfolded in the air between them. It was the same war, the same battles, but something was different. The formations, the retreats, the feints. The Zalzir fought with honor, discipline, and raw strength. But humans fought like something else. They fought to win at any cost. "I've studied your battles," Rourke said. "You're fighting a war of honor. The Vordaks fight a war of annihilation. You cannot beat them on their terms. You must change the rules." The room felt colder. The warriors around Valkor exchanged uncertain glances. They had fought the same way for generations, adapting only in strength and technology, but never in philosophy. To fight without honor was unthinkable. "Your plan," Valkor's voice was dangerously soft. Rourke smiled, but there was no humor in it. "A trap. We draw them and let them believe they have already won. Then we shatter them from within." Valkor stared at the hologram. He saw the possibilities, the unorthodox brutality of it. It was unlike anything the Dominion had ever done. He hated it. He hated that it might work. Outside the palace, the sky burned with the wreckage of dying ships. The homeworld defenses were failing. Time was a luxury he no longer had. The great King Valkor, ruler of the Zalzir, Dominion, conqueror of 10 worlds, had never bowed to another species. But today he had to decide whether his pride was worth the cost of extinction. And for the first time in his life, he hesitated. The War Council chamber was silent except for the faint hum of the holographic display. Valkor sat at the head of the long obsidian table, his piercing gaze locked onto the human standing before him. Elias Rourke had not bowed, had not flinched under the weight of 1,000 years of Zalzir pride pressing down on him. He had simply presented his plan without apology, without hesitation. And that made him dangerous. "You expect me to trust a human with the fate of my empire?" Valkor's voice was a slow simmer, a blade sharpened by disbelief. Rourke met his gaze without fear. "I expect you to do what is necessary to survive. A low growl rumbled from Lord Corix, chest the massive warrior stepping forward, his crimson war cloak swaying with the motion. You insult the Dominion with your arrogance. We are not cowards who hide behind deception. His claws flexed against the table. Honor demands we fight with strength, not tricks. Rourke exhaled through his nose, a quiet, almost amused sound. Honor won't mean much when your homeworld is a wasteland. He turned back to Valcor, unbothered by the tension rising in the room. Your fleet is in ruins. Your warriors are dying. Your world is next. We don't have time for pride. The words landed like a strike to the chest. The truth was an enemy Valcor could not slay. He had seen it with his own eyes as his fleet burned, the unstoppable tide of the Vordax pushing ever closer. He had spent a lifetime believing the Dominion was unbreakable, that strength alone could hold the galaxy at bay. But the Vordax were not a rival kingdom to be conquered. They were a force of nature. Valcor's claws tapped against the armrest of his chair, slow, methodical. Explain your strategy. Rourke brought up a new projection above the table. The Zalzir battle formations flickered in blue and gold, while the Vordax swarmed in waves of red. Your forces are predictable. You fight like a hammer against an anvil. It's worked for centuries, because no one has ever been strong enough to stop you. He paused, letting the weight of the next word settle. The Vordax are stronger. A sharp ripple of unease passed through the gathered warlords. No one said it, but they all knew. They had watched their fleets die, knowing brute strength alone was no longer enough. Rourke's hands moved across the holopad, shifting formations, pulling apart lines. We don't fight their war. We don't meet them head-on. We turn their strength into a weakness. He zoomed in on the Zalzir home system. They rely on overwhelming force, but that makes them predictable. We make them overextend. We make them think they've won. Valcor narrowed his eyes. And then? Rourke's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. We closed the jaws around them. The plan unfolded in brutal efficiency. Feigned retreats, baited invasions, corridors of death. The humans called it asymmetric warfare. Strike where the enemy is weakest, never where they expect. It was a method of war the Dominion had never considered, because it was built on deception, misdirection, and sacrifice. The king felt the weight of it settling into his bones. It was not the way of his people. It was not the way of kings. And yet he could see no other path. A deep silence stretched through the chamber. Lord Corix's voice was a quiet snarl. This is a human's way, not ours. Valcor did not look at him. His gaze remained locked on the holographic battlefield, where for the first time since the war began he saw a glimmer of victory. He exhaled slowly, then stood, his towering form casting a long shadow over the chamber. His warriors watched him, waiting for the command that would seal their fate. The Zalzir do not run from battle, Valcor said, his voice cold as steel. But we do not march to our own deaths either. His claws flexed before curling into a fist. We will fight. And we will fight to win. The decision was made. Whether it would save them or damn them, only time would tell. The first victory came in whispers rather than roars. It was not the crushing triumph of Zalzir warriors standing over broken enemies. There were no grand battles of honor, no glorious last stands. Instead, the Vordax died in the dark in places they had never thought to look. Rourke's plan had begun. Sabotage teams struck deep behind enemy lines. Supply routes collapsed overnight. Isolated Vordax warships disappeared into the void, their distress signals swallowed by jamming fields. Zalzir assassins, once trained for duels and honorable combat, now moved through the shadows, eliminating enemy commanders before their forces could even react. The Vordax, for the first time in their brutal history, hesitated. King Valcor stood on the command deck of his warship, watching a battlefield unlike any he had ever known. This was not the grand clash of fleets he had spent his life mastering. This was deception, a war of ghosts and phantoms. He hated it, but it was working. A holomap displayed enemy movements, red markers, shifting, erratically, uncertain, confused. The swarm had always fought like an avalanche, unstoppable, inevitable. But an avalanche was only dangerous if it had solid ground beneath it. Rourke had pulled that ground away piece by piece. Their advances slowed, one of Valkor's warlords muttered, staring at the shifting formations. They're hesitating. Rourke stood near the display, arms crossed, his face unreadable. They're starting to realize they don't control this war anymore. He tapped a flashing sector on the map. This is where we push. Lord Corrick snarled, his patience worn thin. Enough with these tricks. When do we strike them head on? Rourke barely spared him a glance. When they're weak enough for it to matter. The Zalzir warlord stiffened. This was not their way. They were warriors bred for glorious battle. The idea of striking only when the enemy was weakest felt like cowardice. But Valkor said nothing. He only watched the battlefield. Hours later the trap was sprung. A fleet of Vordak's warships surged into what they thought was an undefended corridor of space, aiming for the Zalzir supply lines. It was a perfect maneuver against an empire that fought with brute force. But against Rourke's tactics, it was suicide. The moment the Vordaks committed their forces, the corridor shifted. Minefields activated along hidden paths, slicing through their ranks. Long-range artillery fire hammered their flanks, forcing them inward. Then the Zalzir warships emerged, smaller in number, but positioned with surgical precision. Instead of a head-on clash, they cut through weak points, breaking formations, isolating vessels, turning the swarm's numbers against itself. It was slaughter. For the first time since the war began, the Vordaks fled. Not a retreat to regroup. A panicked rout. On the bridge of his warship, Valkor watched as the last of the enemy's signals blinked out, their remnants scattered and broken. It was the most decisive victory the Dominion had seen in this war. And yet there was no celebration among his warriors. No chance of triumph. Because this was not a victory won by strength. This was a victory won by fear. He turned to Rourke, studying the human's impassive face. They are running. Rourke nodded. For now. The king narrowed his eyes. You do not sound pleased. Rourke exhaled. Because I know what happens next. A cold silence settled over the command deck. The Vordaks were not an empire with pride to wound. They did not retreat to lick their wounds and scheme. They adapted. And now, they had seen the new shape of this war. Valkor felt a deep unease settle in his chest. He had taken the first step into a type of battle he barely understood. He had bent his traditions, allowed his people to fight like humans. But had he truly changed? Or had he simply delayed the inevitable? The first sign of disaster came in silence. No alarms, no distress signals, no frantic reports. Just the sudden, absolute absence of an entire Zalzir battle group. A fleet of 30 warships had vanished from the grid without a trace. No wreckage. No escape pods. No transmissions. As if they had never existed. King Valkor stood on the bridge of his warship, staring at the empty sector of space where his forces had once been. His warlords murmured among themselves, claws tapping against armor, tails flicking in nervous agitation. Even the strongest among them could not ignore what this meant. The Vordaks had adapted. Rourke stepped forward, his expression grim as he studied the data. They aren't running anymore? Valkor's jaw tightened. What did they do? Rourke gestured toward the holomap, where faint distortions rippled across the void. They learned from us. His voice was tight with frustration. They stopped moving like a swarm and started moving like hunters. Small strike teams. Silent attacks. No wasted movement. He exhaled through his nose. They're using our tactics against us. The king's claws flexed against the railing. The same strategies that had given them victory were now being turned into weapons against them. He had been prepared for an enemy that fought with overwhelming strength. He had not been prepared for an enemy that could learn. A chime echoed through the bridge. An incoming transmission. but not from a Zalzir vessel. The screen flickered to life. A figure appeared, a Vordax unlike any Valkor had seen before. Taller, leaner, its carapace gleaming like black steel. Its mandibles moved with eerie precision as it spoke in heavily distorted galactic standard. King of the Zalzir. Valkor straightened but said nothing. The creature tilted its head slightly as if studying him. Then it continued. We were content to feast upon your strength, to shatter you as we have shattered all before you. Its glowing red eyes narrowed. But you have changed. A slow pause. And so we have changed. Rourke muttered a curse under his breath. The Vordax commander continued, its voice like grinding stone. You think yourself a predator now? A faint chittering noise that almost sounded like amusement. We welcome the challenge. The transmission cut. A cold hush settled over the bridge. Then alarms erupted. The Vordax were already here. Explosions rippled through the Zalzir fleet before their sensors even registered an attack. The enemy had hidden within the cosmic debris, waiting, perfectly timed. The first barrage tore through their outer defenses, shields collapsing under precise, concentrated fire. This was not the blind, overwhelming rush of the swarm. This was a calculated dismantling of the Dominion's forces. Valkor barked orders, his warriors scrambling to reform their ranks, but the battle had already spiraled out of control. Every tactic Rourke had introduced was now being used against them, feigned retreats, sudden ambushes, precision strikes against command ships. For the first time in his life, Valkor understood what it was to be prey. A sharp alert blared through the ship. Rourke's voice was a razor's edge. They've breached the palace. Valkor's blood ran cold. The capital was not just a stronghold. It was the heart of his people, his family, his legacy. If the Vordax had already reached it, the war was no longer about survival. It was extermination. He turned to Rourke. Get me to the surface. Rourke hesitated. Your Majesty, Valkor snarled. Now. The human met his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. Moments later, Valkor stepped onto the landing craft, the fires of his burning world reflected in his eyes. For the first time, the king of the Zalzir was no longer fighting for his empire. He was fighting for everything he had left. The sky over Zalzir Prime burned. King Valkor stepped off the landing craft into a city that was no longer his. The once proud spires of the royal capital lay in ruin, their towering structures reduced to broken husks. Smoke coiled through the air thick with the scent of scorched metal and charred flesh. The Vordax had breached the last defenses and now moved through the streets like shadows of death. This was no invasion. This was an execution. Rourke stepped beside him, scanning the wreckage with calculating eyes. They didn't waste time, he muttered. His fingers tightened around the pulse rifle slung across his chest. They're not just here to take the city. They're here to erase it. Valkor's claws flexed, his fangs bared in a low snarl. The great halls where his ancestors had ruled for generations lay shattered, the banners of the Dominion torn and trampled beneath alien feet. The air trembled with the distant, hollow wail of survivors, his people, hunted through the ruins like vermin. This was his failure. A guttural clicking echoed from the rubble ahead. Valkor's eyes snapped toward movement in the wreckage. A Vordax hunter slithered into view, its black carapace shimmering under the embers of the burning city. It paused, its mandibles twitching as it scented the air. Then it lunged. Valkor met the beast head-on. His blade cleaved through its chitinous exoskeleton, the creature shrieking as it collapsed in a heap of convulsing limbs. Another leapt from the shadows, only to be cut down by a precise shot from Rourke's rifle. The human barely glanced at the kill, already scanning for the next threat. We have to move, Rourke said. The palace won't hold much longer. Valkor turned toward the last standing structure of his kingdom, the shattered remains of his war council chamber. Inside, his remaining commanders and the royal family had barricaded themselves. But it was only a matter of time before the Vordax finished them. He had to get to them. The two warriors pushed forward, cutting through pockets of enemy patrols, moving through the ruins like ghosts. Zalzir warriors who had once scoffed at Rourke's tactics now followed his lead, using cover, moving in coordinated strikes. The old ways of war were dead. The only thing that mattered now was survival. They reached the outer gates of the palace, just as they collapsed inward. Vordax warriors poured through the breach, their black forms swarming like locusts. Inside, the last of the Zalzir defenders stood in a desperate shield wall, their armor slick with blood. Valcor didn't hesitate. With a roar, he tore into the enemy, his warriors rallying behind him. Rourke moved like a phantom, cutting down enemies with clinical precision. The battle turned into a whirlwind of claws, steel, and fire. But it was not enough. A Vordax brute broke through the defensive line, slamming a massive blade into one of Valcor's warlords. The Zalzir crumpled. The line shattered. The enemy surged forward. Valcor felt the impact before he saw it, a searing pain across his ribs as a Vordax blade carved through his armor. He staggered, but before the killing blow could fall, a shot rang out. The Vordax collapsed, a hole burned through its skull. Rourke hauled Valcor back, his face grim. "We're out of time?" Valcor looked up through the smoke and fire. In the distance, the last royal tower stood. His people were inside, and the Vordax were coming. For the first time in his life, the king of the Zalzir knew what it meant to fight not for power, not for conquest, but for the last, fragile embers of his people. And he knew, without doubt, that he would die before he let them go out. The last tower stood on the edge of annihilation. King Valcor's breath came in ragged growls, his body aching from wounds that would have felled lesser warriors. The once mighty fortress of his ancestors loomed ahead, its walls scorched, its banners torn, its great gates broken. Within, the last survivors of the Zalzir dominion, his commanders, his people, his family, held their ground against the oncoming tide. And the tide was rising. The Vordax swarmed through the wreckage, their black exoskeletons gleaming in the dim red glow of the fires. They moved without hesitation, without fear. This was their victory. The Zalzir were nothing more than a final feast before they moved on to the next world. Rourke pressed against the shattered remains of a column, checking his rifle. His expression was unreadable, but Valcor knew what the human was thinking. The fight was already lost. The only question now was how much longer they could hold out. Valcor turned toward him, gripping his bloodstained blade. "We make our stand here." Rourke met his gaze for a long moment. Then he gave a slight nod. "Then, let's make it count." The final battle began. The Vordax struck like a black wave, relentless and endless. Valcor fought with the fury of a dying world, his blade carving through carapace and bone. He was no longer a king. He was a warrior, a beast, a force of destruction. Around him, the last of his people fought with desperate resolve, their war cries echoing through the ruins. Rourke moved through the chaos like a ghost, his shots precise, his movements sharp and efficient. He fought without the brute force of the Zalzir, but with something just as deadly: calculated survival. Every shot was placed for maximum damage. Every movement conserved energy. Every second stretched just a little longer. But seconds were not enough. The line broke. Warriors fell. The Vordax surged forward. Valcor staggered, his breath coming in painful gasps. His armor was shattered, his vision blurred with blood. He saw the last defenders of the tower cut down one by one. And then he saw the doors collapse. Inside, his people screamed. Something in him cracked. With a final roar, Valcor charged into the horde, swinging his blade in a wide arc. He didn't fight to win. He fought to make them bleed, to make them remember that even in death, the Zalzir would not kneel. A clawed hand slammed into his chest, driving him to the ground. He gasped, his strength failing. A Vordax stood over him, its blade rising for the final strike. A shot rang out. The Vordax collapsed. Rourke stood above him, breathing hard, his rifle barrel smoking. He extended a hand. Not yet. Valcor took it. The two warriors stumbled back toward the remains of the tower. The last survivors, wounded, exhausted, looked to them with hollow eyes. There were no more battle plans, no more strategies. And then a sound, a deep, distant rumble. Rourke looked up, his eyes widening. There, here, through the smoke-filled sky, the first Terran warships broke through the clouds. Humanity had come. The Vordax turned, sensing the shift. And then the bombardment began. Columns of fire and steel rained down upon the enemy, the ground trembling beneath the weight of orbital strikes. Terran dropships descended, soldiers pouring out, weapons flashing in the darkness. The tide had turned. Valcor watched as the Vordax lines fractured, their confidence breaking for the first time. The hunters had become the hunted. The battle was over. As the last Vordax fell, Valcor looked at Rourke. The human wiped blood from his brow, his expression unreadable. "You saved my people," Valcor said, his voice hoarse. Rourke exhaled, glancing at the burning ruins. "We saved each other. The war was won. But nothing would ever be the same." For the first time in Zalzir history, humanity had stood beside them, not as enemies, not as subjects, but as something else entirely. As equals.